Hi everyone. So today we are going to read three post-colonial texts. You are already aware because of the last 2 weeks of post-colonial criticism, what post-colonial criticism is. But just to review a little bit, we studied M.A. Caesar and we studied Chinaya Achebe. And both these works criticized colonial literature like Heart of Darkness and talked about the impact of colonization on the colonizers and on the colonized. So now we move to the literature that was being produced in the colonized world, in the post-colonial world. So at the time most of this literature was being written, and even now the post-colonial countries or the regions at that time were in extreme conflict because for one thing, all the things that the Western colonizers built their government on were starting to crumble because of the First World War and the approaching the Second World War. Simultaneously, there were multiple nationalist movements that were taking place in these regions. These nationalist movements were by people who said that their identity, their culture, their independence, the wealth of their countries had been taken away by these Western powers, and they wanted their country for themselves because they had been exploited, they had been harmed in inexplicable ways. So the powers of the British, French, and basically the European colonizing powers were weakening because of the war, because of issues within Europe itself, issues that we discussed and that I mentioned in the last lecture. So amid these kind of crises, these three kinds of works were written. The first work, which we are going to study today, is written by Nagugi Thiong'o. He was a Kenyan author. He is a Kenyan author, critic, social critic, cultural critic, and his works discuss Kenyan society. And in the previous works, the first works that he wrote were in English. He rarely writes in English now. He prefers writing in his own language, in the language of Kenya, because he thinks that people should reclaim their identity, should be proud of their identity, and not feel in any way ashamed of it. So this collection, the story that you have read, Wedding at the Cross, this story is taken from one of his English collections, and the story discusses what the situation. It actually is, for a short story, traces quite a big overall area of time. So the story criticizes capitalism, definitely, materialism. It criticizes the emerging ruling or bourgeoisie middle class of Kenya as well. It criticizes this idea that a person who has been brought up in the traditional Kenyan way is not good enough, and all of the concerns that are very, very polarizing and very problematic in post-colonial countries. Because remember, the colonizers, the European powers, could not handle the populations on their own. They employed the help of the people within the colonies, the people who did not want to be harmed and decided to collaborate, the people who were, like in every country, there are people who look for their self-interest rather than the collective group's interests. So a certain class was born, a social class, which we call the upper class or the elite class, who was of the same race as let's say the colonized people, but in manners and in etiquettes and in the way they lived their life, they were very European. And this class, because it had adopted all the values of the West, this class treated the people who were the native population, who were poor, who had been disenfranchised, in almost the same way as the colonizers. So you will notice that Nagugi Thiong'o, when he writes the story, he shows the character, the protagonist of the story, let's look at his name, Veriku, as part of the Kenyan population. He makes fun of the people who bow down to the settlers in their colonies, who are westernized, and he and that is how he manages to make Miriam, the daughter of a very westernized Christian, fall in love with him, because Miriam was of free spirit. She did not feel that the Christianity and the kind of life that was portrayed in the westernized society was the kind of life she wanted to lead, because her freedom of spirit demanded a return to the kind of life that was part of that she saw all around her. Now, very cool. In the beginning is the embodiment of everything that Miriam wants. He's the embodiment of everything, unfortunately, also that the westernized elite looks down on. So the first thing that I would like you to notice in the story is the way in which Nagugi with Thiong'o describes Veriku, with the split trousers, the dancing, the enjoyment, the free spirit, and the fact that he used to drink, that fact that he basically is a youthful person. I'm going to look at a few lines in the text which I think are important, because remember, see the names, the Kenyan names that are mentioned, like Veriku, in contrast to Miriam's father, Douglas Jones, which is a very westernized kind of name. And it is important because names reflect the tendency to shift towards either a westernized kind of identity or an identity which is essentially Kenyan. So people, and now if you see on if you have the books in front of you, it would be great. On page number 938, the last paragraph where Miriam's father is mentioned, it is the 5th line. He says her father, Douglas Jones, owned several grocery stores, tea rooms around the town. So he's a rich man. He's a person who is rich in that small area. He gets along very well with the white colonizers who stay there, and so basically he is the embodiment of that elite class who looks down upon these people. And at the bottom of the same paragraphs, it is mentioned that Sunday scenes of idleness and idol worship, basically the things that are mentioned that they do not like in the general population. So, but Miriam had an independent spirit, though it had since childhood been schooled with inactivity by Sunday sermons. Thou shalt obey thy father and mother and those that rule over you. It is important to notice the concepts that were being taught in the colonizers. They were treated as childlike, they were treated as naive, and they were told to obey. Just like discriminated populations are populations of women and other groups who are marginalized. And a proper upbringing with rules straight out of Saint Reverend Clive Schomburg's classic British manners for Africans. Now, how extremely patronizing that the specific manners that were written, oh, this is the way you need to behave in society in order to be accepted in society and in order to be liked. So these people were the embodiment of what that reminds me of a title in postcolonial criticism, which says I don't know, brown faces, white masks, or something like that. I'm forgetting it, but it reminds me that they were in essence European. For one thing, they judged Veriku not on the basis of his personality and not on the basis of what kind of a person he was or whether he loved their daughter or not. They judged him on the basis of material wealth, which is in African countries and in many of the colonized places a very Western concept. It is not a concept because with the rise of capitalism and everything, these things were being given a lot of importance, and because he did not have the money, he was not considered important. Now, if you look on the second page, the lines that Douglas Jones speaks or that are mentioned here, which are very essential. We as Christians have a responsibility. I say it again, we do not object to this union, but it must take place at the cross, where the title of the story comes from. A church wedding. Veriku costs money. Maintaining a wife costs money. Is that not so? You note your head. Good. Now, if you notice one thing, which is a very interesting, is that the concept of Christianity, of the essence of Christianity, is in charity, in looking after other people, not in only in the prosperity gospel. So one thing that Nagugi with Thiong'o draws out here is the disparity between religion of sorrows that he mentions later, where people believe that Christ died on the cross because of for the people, because he loved his people and everything. And then there is this concept that Christianity, because it was brought in by the colonizers, it became a symbol of the West itself. It became a symbol of the colonizers itself. So it was very much, in some cases, disliked, and in other cases, even if it was accepted with a lot of modifications, in the sense that it was accepted according to the population's cultural norms. But this kind of exact replication of European norms was considered to be very foreign, considered to be very alien to the land as well, because that kind of Christianity had treated the natives in a very harsh way, in a very bad way. It had looked down on the natives and had created and led to a lot of problems. So the first theme that I would like you to notice is Christianity, and in combination with the kind of Christianity that was being practiced. Remember, as soon as Veriku becomes rich at the end, he joins the church. He joins the kind of church that Douglas Jones joins in the beginning, or Miriam's father joins. But what does he have to give away or give up in order to become that person? And the second thing is capitalism, how to gain money, and when this urge that I will only be able to prosper, I'll only be able to do good and be able to maintain my self-respect and identity as if I'm able to materially prosper, is a very, very westernized notion that was brought to those colonies by the colonizers. And that was the notion that Douglas Jones imbued with his insult when he rejected his proposal for Miriam. And so anything that he did, see, he still managed to marry Miriam because she did not like him, or she did not love him because of money or lack thereof. She loved him because of his nature, his personality, which unfortunately after that insult changed. There's a very interesting line that I would like you to look at on page number 940. It says, although he was trembling, that's when he's leaving their house, a little, he was glad to be in a familiar world, his own world, but he looked at it slightly differently, almost as if he had been wounded and could not anymore enjoy what he saw. So imagine how his identity, his self-respect suffered because of it. And then even when they run away, they have a very good life. Miriam is very happy. So he, in the beginning, despite the insult, manages to retain the character, but he's not able to forget it. It has completely filled his mind and his brain, and that results in him finally abandoning his wife with his mother, and then going out to make money, going to different kinds of there was rumors about what he was doing. He was in prison, he had married again, so multiple things that were heard. And then later on he comes back, but he comes back a changed man. He comes back the kind of man that Douglas Jones would recognize. He comes back a man who has ambition, and in that thirst for ambition and revenge and to regain his self-respect, he loses something essential. He loses sight of who he is as a person, and in doing so, he loses the love of Miriam as well. In the same way, when World War II started, he was employed by the British, and so many people were employed. They went and fought, and again, this was a British war. This was a European war. These people were employed. These people were promised freedom and so many things. And they never got this. On page number 941, it is a very, very, I would say, bitter criticism that you see coming up in the page on the last paragraph when Nagugi writes. He was back in the streets of Nairobi, joining the crowds of the unemployed, recently returned from the war. No jobs, no money rewards. The good British, and in inverted commas, and the wicked Germans were shaking hands with smiles, but questions as to why black people were not employed did not trouble him. So in spite of everything that he had gone through, he was more concerned about his own individualistic needs, which are very foreign to the African people because of the way he had undergone this change. When young men gathered in Pumwani, Karikor, Shori, Moyo, and other places to ask questions, he did not join them. They reminded him of the old association, flirtation with farm workers before before the war. Those efforts had come to naught, even though even those ones which would come to naught. He was in any case ashamed of that past. He thought that if he had been less of a loafer and more enterprising, he would never have been so humiliated in front of Miriam and her mother. Now, this is a very interesting criticism of capitalism, because it feeds into that individualistic ideology that if you are not being successful, it is completely your own fault, and the circumstances and everything that is happening around you is not responsible for it, which is very, very damaging in many ways. For one thing, it is not true, because your circumstances in a lot of ways limit you and stop you. Yes, you can work hard. You must have heard that American phrase, to pull yourself up with your bootstraps and something. But how can you do that if from every single side you are being discriminated against, you are being capitalized upon in many ways, and your labor is being exploited, but nothing is being given to you? And that was happening with Veriku. But he felt that it was his own fault and that he needed to change. And in that process of change, he was self-harming a lot without realizing it. So, and then when we realize that we have won something, is that thing even something important? Is that thing even something to rejoice for? Those are the questions that this story asks. It also is, there's the theme of love. Love on the basis of what? Love on the basis of authenticity, or love on the basis of materialism? And you see the differences between both ideologies. There is Miriam's love for Veriku, which is very pure, which is based only on his own personality and what kind of a person he was. But then there is the fake kind of love that you see at the end between Douglas Jones and the newly changed and transformed what is the name? Let's see. What does he name himself? The British name. Yes. Dodge Livingstone Jr. So he changes his name too at the end, and that is the kind of love that develops between the in-laws and Veriku, now as Livingstone Jr., is a kind of love based on material, because they respect him only because he's rich. They don't respect him because of who he was, because they would then otherwise have respected him beforehand, right? And at the end, with Mariamu adjusting to the changes, she's had 2 children, and she realizes at the end, when he is having that wedding, the wedding that the family mentioned years back at the cross, in a very, very westernized Christian way, she realizes that the person she fell in love with is no longer there. And she says that no, she cannot marry him because that person, she's already married and that person is dead. And that tells you about the kind of loss that is generated. So the things that he points out are the classism that emerged because of colonization, extreme classism. And this classism led to this kind of identity crisis, feelings of insecurity, problems of basic human, self-respect. Simultaneously, there is another place in the story where he mentions the factory workers, where he mentions the revolt against the colonizers, the revolt which resulted in so many African laborers being carted off to concentration camps and their land taken away, and which Veriku somehow manages to corroborate with the colonizers, and so he manages to retain his lands and even gain other people's lands, and that is how he gets rich. So you see, in this kind of class consciousness that I have to succeed at the cost of my own brethren is the kind of thing that the colonizers imbued people with by creating this kind of class consciousness. Now, so simultaneously, Christianity, capitalism, class consciousness, internal struggle, divide, and the new emerging government that came, which all the people who had been there, the South Asian population, it ran them away, and in the name of nationalism. And that was another kind of problem that rose and gave it in the story. It creates further opportunities of gaining wealth for Verico. But if you look at it from the point of view that Nagugi Thiong'o mentions it, it's because he is showing that there are so many things, so much violence, so much discord that is going on, and all those things become a part of the story, become a part of Kenyan life, and that is what he's criticizing. He is not valorizing the nationalist or nationalism movements either. He is showing that those nationalist movements were again led by the kind of elite that was created by the colonizers, the kind of elite that they left everyone with, which led to loads of problems. And then if you look at the ending of the story, where she says no to the wedding, and at the end, Livingstone became truly a stone. Her father wept, her mother wept. They all thought her a little crazed, and they blamed the whole thing on these breakaway churches, the new kind of the Christianity, the religion of Soros. They're blaming this on, and churches that really worship the devil, which again is their own Europeanized view of looking at these people. No properly trained priest, etc., etc. And the men and women outside went on singing and dancing to the beat of drums and tambourines, their faces and voices raised to the sky. So at the end, all the love, all the hope that she had seems to have dissolved into nothing. And that conflict, this conflict that is depicted here, and this tragedy that is depicted there, the tragedy of love, that is inexplicably shows you how two individuals' simple life can be affected by these big things that are happening in society, like colonialism, even nationalist, anti-colonial movements, capitalism, materialism, all of these things. Why these things? Why do we need to look at these things in a more in-depth way, and to understand that our lives are not isolated from them, that we are part of them? This literature, post-colonial literature here, teaches us these things. I hope you like the story. It's a very beautiful story, and it employs realism. It's realistically written. It doesn't sugarcoat anything, and it portrays it yet with an element of change, an element of a mounting suspense. So I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will discuss the next story in our next video. Thank you.